Thank you for attending today's Stress, Trauma, and Resilience seminar presented by the UCLA Division of Population Behavioral Health. Today, we are fortunate to have Dr. Caitlin Costello present. Dr. Caitlin Costello is an associate clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco. She is the training director for Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Fellowship Program and the medical director of the Child and Adolescent Outpatient Services. She completed medical school and a general psychiatry residency at Johns Hopkins University, fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry at Columbia and Cornell Universities, and fellowship in forensic psychiatry at UCSF. Her interests include medical education, curriculum development, obsessive compulsive and tic disorders, the interface between psychiatry and the legal system, and juvenile justice. Welcome, Caitlin Costello. We're happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me to talk today about social media and youth participating in social media and the risks that they face and what we can do about them. I have no relevant disclosures. We will be focusing on identifying both clinical and legal risks associated with social media use in youth, talking about the legal background and status of minors interacting online, and developing a plan to assess and advise patients and families around online risks. It's no surprise to anyone that young people really like screen media, including social media. The most recent Common Sense Media report indicated that entertainment screen use increased more between 2019 and 2021 than in the previous 4 years for both teens and tweens, which again is unsurprising given the pandemic, making non-screen based entertainment options harder to find. What are they doing online? So the differences between teens and tweens show up in the rates of social media use and to a degree the sites that they are using as well. So teenagers favor Instagram over Snapchat over Facebook. They spend on average an hour and 27 minutes a day using social media. 34% of teens say they enjoy it a lot. For tweens, only 38% have used social media and 18% use it every day. When they say they like it a lot, what does that really mean? Well, interestingly, for both teens and tweens, the percent who enjoy using social media a lot is lower than the percent who use it every day. So we have teens here who are using social media every day despite not enjoying it a lot. Although social media use is extremely common, access is not equitable across all demographic groups. In particular, access to home computers is lower in ethnically minoritized populations, and entertainment screen media use is higher in those groups. Hard to demonstrate causation here, but those seem likely to be related, that people who are less likely to have access to a home computer may be more likely to use entertainment screen use because that can be accessed easily by smartphone. We talked about social media site use a little bit already, and of note, this does change over time. And this doesn't include things like TikTok, which in some surveys are counted as online video use. So just to make that note as well when we're thinking about what's really popular. Also, watching YouTube videos is really popular among teens and also among tweens, and that's not going to be reflected in these numbers. Rates of reading for entertainment went down during the pandemic, unfortunately. I am going to be focusing a lot on the risks of social media use, and I don't want to discount the benefits. So there are lots of benefits to social media use in young people. They include socialization, especially helpful for young people who might be socially isolated otherwise based on where they live, based on not having access to in-person interactions with people who share commonalities with them and so forth. Building communities among people with various interests and characteristics, being able to gather together easily. Education and digital learning became very important during the pandemic. Access to information, independence, and access to crisis services, among other benefits. So we will be talking about a hypothetical case. So imagine you are doing a clinical evaluation of a 14-year-old girl, and if you're not a clinician, you can substitute the type of conversation you are most likely to have with a teenager from your own perspective, whether that be as a teacher talking to a student, as a parent talking to a child, etc. And during this conversation, you are asking her about her social media use. And she mentions that she has been exchanging photographs with a boy she met online. So please feel free to toss into the chat, what other information do you want to know based on what she has told you so far?
We have somebody saying his age.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of photos? She met him. Does she know this person IRL? What type of photos? We got that a couple times. We have his age several times. Where does he live? How did she meet him? And age and what type of photos are coming up again. Do her parents know? Have you ever video chatted? What kinds of other personal information has she shared? Did you meet the person through a personal connection? The method of social media use? Has he asked her to meet? What site are they talking through?
Yes, this is great. So all of these are the same questions I would want to ask. How did you meet him? Who is he? How old is he? Have you video chatted? Do you even know he is the age he says he is or who he says he is? Have you met in real life? Are you planning to meet in real life? Do your parents know about this? What are these photos that you are exchanging? And so forth. So lots of additional information raised by the scenario we have here. What potential risks does this patient face? Or student or child? Again, toss your ideas into the chat.
Got some great responses already. Sex trafficking is coming up, being abused or hurt, being kidnapped, the images being shared, grooming for abuse, bullying, grooming is coming up a couple of times, stalking, online predators.
Yes, absolutely. Lots of potential risks here, including some pretty frightening ones. So what are the clinical risks of social media use? Well, they range from depression to anxiety to decreased overall well-being. Social comparison, where a young person sees what other people have posted online, and although it's a highly curated version of that person's life, the young person viewing it may compare themselves unfavorably to what they're seeing online. Exposure to mental health content in a negative way that may lead to social contagion, cyberbullying, possible fallout and risks from sexting, exposure to substance use, which has been demonstrated to potentially be linked to increased rates of substance use through peer injunctive norms, which are basically what you think your peers find to be normal or normative. And then social media addiction, and various studies have found that some people have behaviors in response to social media that resemble behavior that we see with addictive substances. The question about mental health effects is actually kind of complicated. Studies aimed at revealing overall effects of social media use on mental health have had mixed results. One large study looking at 3 large data sets, found the association between digital technology use and adolescent well-being to be negative, but quite small. Another review of meta-analyses found a mix of associations, mostly small. They were unable to distinguish cause and effect. So it is complicated. Some of the reasons for why this is complicated may be related to that teens who use social media the most actually also tend to have higher rates of in-person social interactions and maybe just be more sociable overall. And the way social media is playing into the picture there might be different from a teen who is otherwise socially isolated from in-person interactions and is engaging mostly through online interactions. It also may be related to that there are specific times and ways and people for whom social media does have a negative effect on mental health. These include potentially a window of vulnerability, where one study found that higher social media use predicted decreased life satisfaction 1 year later in girls ages 11 to 13, and then boys ages 14 to 15. The pattern of engagement may make a difference as well. A longitudinal study found that in girls, but not in boys, social media use in early adolescence and increased social media use over time predicted suicidality in young adulthood. And then the type of engagement with social media may be important as well. A meta-analysis showed that engaging in social media use by way of one-to-one communication with one person, self-disclosure in a mutual online friendship, positive and funny experiences on social media mitigated the feelings of loneliness and stress that may be associated. Detrimental engagement, on the other hand, seemed to be social media use that involves social comparison, fear of missing out, and exposure to negative content. Talking about social comparison a little bit more. Last year, the Wall Street Journal published an article releasing inside documents from Facebook, showing that Instagram, owned by Facebook or now Meta, is toxic for teen girls in particular. So this is one of the slides. This was an inside Instagram slide that was released, where it appears that Instagram knows from their own research that teens who struggle with mental health say Instagram makes their mental health worse. And this was for teen girls in particular. Quotes from that presentation include, "We make body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teen girls. Teens blame Instagram for increases in the rate of anxiety and depression. This reaction was unprompted and consistent across all groups. The internal researchers concluded that the issues were partly specific to Instagram, especially social comparison." So that's Instagram and not other social media sites. And reasons for that may include that Instagram is really image focused, whereas TikTok has a component of performance. Twitter is more text focused and so forth, but Instagram being so image focused makes social comparison a more significant issue there. So despite Instagram knowing about the effect on teens' mental health, what Mark Zuckerberg said in a congressional hearing was, "The research that we've seen is that using social apps to connect with other people can have positive mental health benefits." Instagram does show some awareness about at least young children and risks of social media use. So Adam Mosseri said in September that they were going to require parental permission to join for kids younger than 13, that the version for those kids wouldn't have ads and would have age-appropriate content and features. And at the same time that he's saying we're going to start requiring parental permission to join for children under age 13, that is actually already required by federal law. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Other potential problems: Instagram promoting pages glorifying eating disorders to teen accounts. So specifically promoting them to teen accounts, images glorifying eating disorders. Exposure to negative mental health content is another risk. So here's a graph of Instagram posts over time containing one of 5 popular hashtags related to non-suicidal self-injury. So those include cutting and other forms of self-harm. And we can see this being quite high and having gone up at the end of this study period. Instagram, in response to knowing that negative mental health content is a risk for young people using it, said that they would stop allowing graphic images of self-harm, such as cutting, or would not show non-graphic self-harm related content either. A little bit later, they expanded that to say they wouldn't allow fictional depictions of self-harm or suicide on Instagram, and would remove other imagery that may not show self-harm or suicide, but does include associated materials or methods. And this, so this was back in 2019, so presumably would have been well in place by now. And yet I did an Instagram search for self-harm, and these were the first things I found. And one thing to note here is I don't actually know how to use Instagram. This was the first Instagram search I've ever done. And this took 2 seconds to find. There have been concerns about TikTok as well. So it's not just Instagram. Here's an article about TikTokers using secret hashtags to discuss self-harm. So even if controls are in place, teens will find a way around those too. Social contagion of mental health symptoms may be a risk as well. So some of you have likely heard about the TikTok tics phenomenon. And this is where it was noted that a high number of teenage girls were presenting to clinics with tics that were quite atypical for how we normally see tic disorders. And so they started at a much older age, presented quite dramatically with complex tics that aren't usually how tics start, and they're just very clinically different from how we typically see tic disorders progress. And it was noted that many of these girls had seen people with tics like that on TikTok first. Another area of clinical risk is lots of risks related to cyberbullying, which can occur by texting, social networking sites, chat rooms to the extent that those still exist. A majority of teens have been the target of cyberbullying, according to the latest study from the Pew Research Center. Cyberbullying is associated with depression, anxiety, behavior issues, eating disorders, irritability, self-pity, decline in school performance, truancy, and somatic issues in both the bully and people who are bullied. Both groups, the bully and the bullied, also have an elevated risk of suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and suicide death. Youth who are minoritized in various ways are at higher risk for being cyberbullied. And factors that increase the risk for psychopathology include feelings of social isolation, perceived burdensomeness, presence of pre-existing psychopathology, history of adverse childhood experiences, and high severity of cyberbullying. Another area related to clinical risks is sexting. So sexting essentially involves transmission of material that would qualify as child sexual abuse material unless the state law designates otherwise. So some states have exempt sexting from the laws governing the transmission of child sexual abuse material, and some don't. From a 2018 meta-analysis, it was found that 24.7% of juvenile participants had received a sext, 14.8% had sent a sext, 12% had forwarded a sext without consent, and 8.4% had had their own sext forwarded without consent. This is, young adolescents as a group together, rates of sexting unsurprisingly go up from early to late adolescence. So by the time they are 16 and 17, it's more than 24.7% who are sexting. Clinical risks include fear, stress, and shame for both the sender and the receiver. Girls tend to be disproportionately highly affected. There's an increased risk of suicide attempts and suicidal ideation. Sexting is associated with anxiety and depression, delinquent behavior, alcohol and drug use, and smoking. It's also associated with earlier age of sexual activity, having multiple sexual partners, and a decreased likelihood of using contraception. Moving on to legal risks associated with youth social media activity. So cyberbullying can have legal risks for the bully. Sexting can have legal risks for the sender and the receiver. Youth can be exposed to online solicitation and predation, cyber stalking and cyber harassment, and then a broad category of what we could call reputation damage, which may or may not involve legal risks. But what this is having posts viewed by unintended audiences or viewed in a different way than the poster intended. They can be reviewed by admissions officers and employers. They can even have criminal content depending on the content of the post. Legal risks of sexting in particular. So this is a little bit complicated. Essentially, it depends on whether the state has a law that differentiates juvenile sexting from possession or transmission of child sexual abuse material. In states without such laws, teens who engage in sexting could be charged if they are the offender or the victim. And the offender here might be considered someone who forwarded someone else's photos without permission, and the victim would be the person whose photos were forwarded, but both of them could be charged under these laws. Despite the fact that in many of the states that this applies to, consensual sex in real life between older teens is legal, but sending photos of themselves is not. So here are what the states looks like. So the red states here, which includes California, for the first time we are a red state, are the states without a sexting law. And so these states, youth are vulnerable to being charged under the regular child sexual abuse material laws. Most teens who sext are not criminally charged. Charges are more likely to be brought in the case of particular circumstances, which include sexting with malicious intent, sexting that occurs along with bullying, coercion, harassment, non-consensual forwarding, distributing photographs widely with the motive of harming the person's reputation, large age differences between the participants, sexual images involving young children, images that are especially explicit, graphic, or violent, and an adult sending nude photos to a minor. So back to our case. So we have this 14-year-old girl who is exchanging photos with a boy she met online, and she tells us that the photographs are sexually explicit. If you were a clinician or a teacher, any obligations to tell anyone else about this? Her parents, the law, anyone? Please feel free to answer in the chat.
So far, we are
I
getting
think
all
a
yeses.
lot of yes answers. And yes, so in the state of California, this is a mandated report for sexual abuse. And the reason that it is a mandated report for sexual abuse is that Assembly Bill 1775 added to the definition of child sexual abuse the exchange or transmission or downloading of sexually explicit images of children. And California does not have an exemption for sexting for young people. So this is considered transmission of child sexual abuse material under the law, And because that has been added to the definition of child sexual abuse, that is a mandated report. I'm seeing also responses about discussing this with the teen, making the call together. I think those things are good ideas as well. What if your patient only received sexually explicit images? Do you have to report them? Seeing a lot of yes answers. And it may depend a little bit on the circumstances. So someone who did not voluntarily receive the image, you may have kind of less of a likelihood of falling under the law there that added to the definition of child abuse. It's a little bit less clear if they only received sexually explicit images, and it's not a definite no. So one answer about consulting with Child and Family Services about whether this is reportable, that might be a case where I would make that consultation. Is it's not just the way the law itself reads, it's not totally clear. So California Assembly Bill 1775, which went into effect in 2015, added to the definition of sexual exploitation under child sexual abuse, knowingly downloading, streaming, or accessing through electronic or digital media. So did this person knowingly download? I guess would be the question there. Again, a little bit complicated. I'm not an attorney. I'm assuming most of you are not attorneys. That might be a case where I would make the consultation. So under the broad category of reputation damage, which may or may not involve actual criminal or civil liability, but definitely can involve harm. Here's just an example of what seems like a fairly innocuous tweet that a superintendent of a school apologized for the parking lots not being plowed. The teen suggested that the superintendent should grab a shovel and get out there himself. Probably fairly sarcastically or jokingly, that teen got suspended. That might not seem like such a huge consequence. It is going to be the first thing you find when you go Google search this teen, and it will be online forever. Is that what the teen intended? Is that, what is a reasonable consequence for that teen? And those are the things that we're talking about when we talk about reputation damage. This can include legal liability. So back in December of last year, there were a number of threats made towards schools. Unclear how serious any of these were, and at least one teen was arrested due to this. Another teen was arrested for tweeting a terror threat to American Airlines, despite the fact that she immediately tried to walk that back and say that she wasn't going to do anything to American Airlines. Okay, back to our case here. So we talked about what risks she might face. What legal protections, if any, does she have here? I'm not saying anything in the chat, which might mean that people think that she has no legal protections. And that might actually be the case. And so why would that be? Well, this is governed under contract law. And the reason for that is that agreeing to the terms of service of a social media site is the equivalent of entering a contract with that site. For adults, there's a longer history of courts upholding click wrap and browse wrap agreements as having created a valid contract binding the user to the terms of service. A click wrap agreement is where you click yes or I agree to the terms of service. A browse wrap agreement doesn't require you to even affirm that you agree to the terms of service. It's just saying that by continuing to browse, knowing that the terms of service are available to you if you choose to read them, you are agreeing to those terms. When this comes up in court, the question is generally, did the customer have reasonable notice of and manifest consent to the online agreement? And it has been generally considered that continuing to browse, knowing that the terms of service are available, is the equivalent of manifesting consent to the online agreement. The reason they are called click wrap and browse wrap is from an older term, a shrink wrap agreement, which was back in the olden days when software came in boxes. Opening the shrink wrap was the equivalent of saying you agreed to their term of service. So again, courts are upholding that any reasonable adult would have understood the basic terms of the contract. And then the question rises about non-adults. Do they become legally bound by click wrap and browse wrap agreements? So there isn't as long of a legal history of this, but to the extent there is, the answer is generally yes. So the background here is that the legal protection for children online has been quite limited. There is one federal law, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, requiring parental consent for the collection or use of children's personal information online, but it applies only to children under the age of 13. At the time when this law went into effect in the year 2000, the companies were directing online marketing at children and collecting personal information without parental consent or notification. And that young children in particular would be less likely to be able to differentiate marketing from actual content online. So this was not made knowing today's risks. It couldn't have been made knowing today's risks. Even at the time, in the year 2000, it was criticized for cumbersome verification requirements, inadequate protection, and inadequate enforcement. It also applies only to children under the age of 13. This is why many social media sites use 13 years as the minimum age for participation. And when Instagram said that they were going to start requiring parental permission for children under age 13, well, they were already required by federal law to have parental permission for children under age 13. This requirement is easily circumvented. So most social media sites just require the person to enter a birth date that makes them 13 or older. Why age 13? Well, they did do some research here. The American Psychological Association was consulted, and they stressed that children under age 13 lacked the developmental capacity to understand the request for information and implications for their privacy. Well, that brings up a question though. Do adolescents over age 13 understand the potential consequences of sharing their personal information online? Again, this is a law from the year 2000. This is when we were getting AOL CDs in the mail, dialing in with our dial-up, and then, social media was a limited number of online chat rooms, essentially.
You've got mail.
It just wasn't made with today's risks in mind. If it had been, I do wonder if the age would have been higher of requiring parental permission. But it wasn't. And what that leaves us with is that juveniles ages 13 to 17 are allowed to legally consent to terms of service just like adults. They're allowed to enter these legal contracts just like adults. This has been upheld in court in a couple of cases, despite the fact that in almost every other legal context, they're recognized as different from adults, less mature, less able to consent and contract. This comes up in the criminal setting as well. Juvenile culpability has been recognized as being different from adult culpability in a series of Supreme Court cases that progressed from getting rid of the juvenile death penalty to getting rid of juvenile life without parole for non-homicide offenses to getting rid of automatically sentencing juveniles to life without parole even for homicide offenses. The decision in one of these cases, just as an example, cited research showing that adolescents compared to adults are immature. They have less sense of responsibility. They're prone to recklessness, impulsivity, risk-taking. They are more vulnerable to peer pressure, and they are less able to assess the consequences of their actions. Minors are also recognized as being different from adults in lots of other legal settings. So minors can acquire property, but considered incapable of managing it. They can't vote, they can't serve on juries, they can't marry without parental consent, they can't purchase alcohol and tobacco, they can't own firearms. And a minor's contract is voided if the minor chooses to void it in most cases, except these online contracts with social media sites, where juveniles are treated like adults. Now, why do we think that juveniles may be less capable than adults of understanding the implications of their actions and making the decisions that will lead to positive social media engagement with mitigation of their risks? I think this comes down to the fact that the skills for different aspects of decision-making reach maturity at different rates, and the relevant ones here don't reach maturity until quite late in development. So many skills related to legal decision-making in other contexts besides deciding about these online contracts seem to mature around mid-adolescence. The juveniles under age 15 performed more poorly than adults on comprehension of their Miranda rights, but ages 15 and up performed similarly to adults. Juveniles under age 16 performed more poorly than adults in a test of competency to stand trial, but juveniles 16 and up performed similarly to adults. Just of note, these were tests of the understanding of these issues and not tests of the actual decisions that adolescents made in these legal contexts. So these were really cognitive types of tests. In contrast, aspects of decision-making skills that involve psychosocial maturity appear to develop later in adolescence. My favorite study to illustrate this is by Steinberg and colleagues. They looked at young people in groups ages 10 to 30, and they tested them in two different areas. One was pure cognitive skills. So these are things like working memory, digit span, verbal fluency. And they found that as kids got older, these skills increased, but only until about age 16, and then they leveled off. This matches up really well with lots of other research about testing pure cognitive skills. They get about as good as they're going to get at age 16. That's as smart as we ever were. In contrast, the tests of psychosocial maturity looked quite different. Psychosocial maturity, they tested risk perception, sensation seeking, impulsivity, the resistance to the influence of peers, and orientation towards the future as opposed to orientation towards the present. These didn't start showing difference until age 16 and continued to show differences well into the 20s. So the 18 to 21-year-old group did worse than the 26 to 30-year-old group. And here's that graph. Looking at the graph, the 15-year-olds didn't do any better than the 10-year-olds. On the graph, they look a little bit worse. This didn't reach statistical significance in this study, but other studies have shown that age 15-ish is about sort of the peak of impulsivity. So the 15-year-olds may actually be doing worse than 10-year-olds in some of these psychosocial skills. And then just to really hit this point home, this is the difference in these graphs. Cognitive maturity peaks in mid-adolescence. Psychosocial maturity doesn't start rising until mid-adolescence. And so we have these teens with amazing cognitive skills, very, very smart, making very, very bad decisions. I find this graph very helpful in my own clinical work with parents to help in understanding why their teen who is getting straight A's in all their AP classes is doing such foolish things in their free time. To complicate this a little bit, the context of the decision-making matters. So Steinberg and colleagues who have done lots of research in this area have concluded that by age 16-ish, adolescents are capable of making adult-level decisions in particular situations. And those are situations that permit deliberative, reasoned decision-making with minimized emotional and social influences and with consultation available from expert adults. On the other hand, they tend to make immature decisions in situations that elicit impulsivity, have high levels of emotional arousal, social coercion, or that don't encourage consultation with adults. All of this maps on very well to what modern brain science has shown us about the developing brain, that changes in myelination, synaptic pruning, and development of the prefrontal cortex occur at least into the mid-20s. Combine that with increased susceptibility to effects of dopamine during puberty, you've got increased risk-taking and reward-seeking combined with poor psychosocial maturity in these teens. This is relevant to how they participate online. When they enter these click wrap and browse wrap legal contracts, they're likely to do that without logical reflection, without adult consultation, and without considering the risks of participation. How do I know that? Well, I myself have never read an entire terms of service agreement. And if I'm not reading them, I think it's very unlikely that teenagers are. The circumstances of deciding what to post online are also likely to elicit immature decision-making skills. So they're not posting with a lot of logical reflection, and this is highly socially salient to adolescence, which is a setup for immature decision-making skills. All right, so back to our case. How can you help reduce this girl's risks or mitigate any damage that may have already occurred by what she's doing online? And again, would love to see ideas in the chat.
We've got 3 votes for providing some psychoeducation and education, bringing parents into the discussion. Another person said bringing parents in. We've got lots of psychoeducation, supervising use.
Love it, all of this.
Safety planning, a support group.
Yes, 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 all of these things. In addition, the first thing I would do is go back in time to when I first met her. And in my first encounter with a patient, I talk about confidentiality and what are the things that I have to disclose and to whom. And I include that in my confidentiality disclaimers, that if I learn about transmission or receiving sexually explicit images of minors, that is something that I am required to report. All right, so how do we protect these teens online? Well, if the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act were developed now, I think there's a very good argument to be made that the age limit should not be 13, it should be older. That would be unlikely to be successful now. Teens are technologically savvy. They're more technologically savvy than the lawmakers, heavily invested in online interaction, and will find ways to circumvent whatever age restrictions. Policies and legislation that recognize adolescents' impulsivity and poor consideration of risks may have more promise here. So California is ahead of the trend in this area. In 2015, the online eraser law was enacted, which both prohibited websites from marketing specific types of products to minors in California. These included alcohol, tobacco, weapons, etc., and requires websites and online services to allow users under age 18 to remove their content and information and clearly inform them how to do so. So they have to allow users, California users, to erase their online postings. And that's helpful. And by the time a teen realizes that they should be erasing the post, the damage may have already been done. And that's probably why they realize they should erase the post. And erasing a post can't do anything about that post already having been forwarded to other people and disseminated otherwise. The trend continues in California. So the California Consumer Privacy Act of 2018, which went into effect in 2020, established increased privacy rights for California customers over their personal information collected by certain businesses. This is not just juveniles, but does include juveniles, which include the right to know about how their information is being collected and used, the right to delete it, opt out of the sale of it. For children under age 13, this has to be an active parental opt-in or opt-in by the child for children 13 to 15, and right to non-discrimination for exercising their rights. This was followed up by the California Privacy Rights Act, which of note was a ballot proposition in the 2020 election. So lots of things in this area are being done by ballot proposition. It commences in the 2022 to 2023. So this is partly in effect and will go fully in effect next year. It modifies the definition of which businesses are covered, and it puts more requirements on what they are allowed to do and what the restrictions are on sensitive personal information. And sensitive personal information is, things like social security numbers and things that are particularly identifiable. It also established an enforcement agency, the California Privacy Protection Agency. Another example of existing legislation. So in most states, cyberbullying can be prosecuted. And this may be under specific cyberbullying laws or under existing laws that also encompass cyberbullying behavior. And most states require schools to do things about cyberbullying. There's also pending legislation. So there is an assembly bill in California that is still working its way through. If it is passed, it would commence in 2024. That sets new standards for businesses that are likely to be accessed by children, including requiring them to have the highest possible level of privacy. And it defines a child as under 18, not under 13. So this may or may not go into effect. Another related bill was just killed recently by the Senate Appropriations Committee. It would have empowered parents to sue social media companies for employing addictive algorithms and features to hook children and harm their mental health. All right, so what can we do about this? Really though, there are things we can do. Parents can monitor their teenagers' online activities, engage them in discussion of posting habits and decisions. Remember that consultation with adults is one of the factors that leads to better decision-making among adolescents. It may be helpful for parents to know that they do potentially face legal liability themselves for their children's online behavior. However, a Common Sense Media survey in 2018 found that parents themselves spend more than 9 hours a day on average with screen media, and yet 78% of them think that they are good media and technology role models for their children. 40% were highly aware of what their children saw on social media. So that's not zero, and it's not a majority. Schools. So there are lots of school curricula on digital literacy and citizenship. These can start quite early. This is an example that starts in kindergarten. Clinicians, we can assess our patients' online behaviors and discussion of the risks, be mindful of the tendency of them to find ways to get around whatever laws there are. Be aware that there's really little oversight afforded to our adolescent patients online, and that the potential consequences of their online activity can be quite severe. And then we can help with damage control from activity that has occurred. When we're doing a risk assessment, which I think we should all be doing if we're clinicians, is learn the specifics. What apps are they using? What are they viewing? What are they posting? Different apps have different risks associated with them, and that's hard to know if you don't know some things about the apps. I am not a social media user, particularly myself. I've learned a lot about this from my patients, who are generally happy to tell me about it. Assess the positives. It's always a good place to start assessing the positives. It's important to recognize that they do get benefit from their social media interactions. And then go on to assessing the risks. Are online connections taking the place of in-person connections? Are they being exposed to upsetting or traumatizing content? Is it having negative impacts on their mental health? Assess for specific risky behaviors, including the facilitation of dangerous in-person activities, posting content likely to result in reputation damage, facilitating substance abuse, exposure to cyberbullying, cyberstalking, online predation, and sexting. And again, if you're a clinician, you may want to warn your patients that if you hear about the exchange of sexually explicit images of minors, that it is a mandated report. And then assessing how we can be helpful, educating about risk, safety planning, damage control, evaluation and treatment of related mental health symptoms, and recruiting parents to be part of the solution. It's not just mental health clinicians. So the American Academy of Pediatrics has advice for pediatricians. This one is specific to sexting, but recommends incorporating discussion of sexting into their regular anticipatory guidance with teens. And then all of us, regardless of how we interact with children, if we interact with children, you can be aware of existing and pending legislation. So some of these come up on ballot propositions in California. So what are you voting for? Advocate for new or additional legislation, participation in educational programs for youth and parents. And then you'll consider how we engage with social media ourselves. How do we engage with these companies? What do we think about these companies? Do we want to be giving them our business? That is what I have to say about youth and social media, and I would be delighted to hear any questions.
Thanks so much, Dr. Costello. We have a couple of clarifying questions from the case example, and then we have some questions coming into the Q&A. If folks want to post there, feel free. The follow-up questions from the 14-year-old who received the explicit image were, does it matter what social media platform it happens on?
I cannot think of a way that it matters. If there's a follow-up about why someone thinks it matters, I would love to hear that.
Great, thank you. And then the second follow-up on the case example was just to clarify, it's reportable under the age of 18.
Yes.
Okay, great. Now we have some more general questions. Any recommendations for specific educational programs for youth and parents? I'm a school social worker, so looking for more universal preventative solutions too.
Yes, so some of it's going to be dependent on the specific school population. So hard to know about that, but the common sense education one, and I can go back to that slide so you can see what it was. Seems to be a pretty solid K-12 curriculum to me.
Yep, I've thumbed through it myself. It looks fantastic. We're going to also be linking to that on our Learning Center as well, but I recommend that folks check out the Common Sense Media website. They've got some amazing resources. Related question, what resources might be available to parents to monitor their child's phone or social media usage?
Yes. So I guess one thing to talk to parents about is, do they want to try to employ technological controls? So there are parental controls for smartphones and for other electronic devices. Do they want to try to do that? And I don't know that there's a right answer there. May depend on the age and the maturity of the child. And also remember that teens find ways to get around these things as well. Other things to talk to parents about are, what age do you want your child to have a smartphone? And is the age that most of their peers are getting a smartphone, is that really the right age for kids to have that? What's your household policy about social media use? Are you going to require them to friend you on social media, to share their password with you? Are you going to actually monitor their interactions? And again, remember that it's hard to know whether or not they have a separate account that they're not inviting you to. What kinds of discussions are you having with your teen about their social media use?
Yeah, I think that's such an essential point, is just having a discussion about this, right? I talk to some parents sometimes who have no idea what their kid's doing on social media versus the parent who's actively engaging with the child on, what are you searching for on YouTube? What are you using this for? Here's a whopper of a question. How would you suggest weaning clients or helping parents wean their children off of social media? I also thought this question was going to say helping parents wean themselves off of social media, but this question specifically is talking about the kids.
Yeah, so that's tough. I think that steps 1, 2, and 3 are engagement of the child in this, and getting them on board with the idea that they should. And that's probably going to be a lot of motivational interviewing techniques, and really ongoing discussions about what is social media doing for you and how is it getting in your way? And what consequences have you had or are you going to have? And what would your life be like without it? And, what about an experiment with not using it for a day? And what happens and how did you feel? I have had families, of kids that I work with who have done things like screen breaks for the whole family for a month. That has been more successfully implemented in my experience with families with younger children. And the parents and kids found that it was really valuable for them each individually and for their whole family and their family relationships and communications.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a whole slew of questions coming in. So Dr. Costello, if you could either stay on to answer these, or if you'd be willing to answer them via email, we'd really appreciate it. Back to
yes, I'm happy to stay on and to answer by email later as well.
Okay, wonderful. You apparently had a very juicy case example, because we're back to the case example. If both parties are under 18 and exchanging sexual pictures, is that reportable?
If both parties are under 18 and exchanging sexual pictures, is that reportable? So if the pictures are of a minor, yes.
Yep.
And so that's where some states have laws that exempt teen-to-teen sexting from this, and California is not one of those states.
All right. Any recommendations for how to support parents specifically around monitoring content around violence and radical extremism? Another big question.
So that one's that's also a tough question, and I don't have a great answer for it. It's been hard to demonstrate in research what the connection is between exposure to violence and committing violence. And it's complicated and there's lots of factors. And at the same time, I very much see how and why parents worry about this. And I think it is part of the greater social media discussion that families need to be having more than most families are. Parents need to be asking how their teens are engaging online. How are they deciding where to go and what to post? What are they seeing? What concerns do they have about what they're seeing? How has what they're seeing on social media changed their mind? And teens aren't going to tell their parents everything, and most of them tell their parents some things.
It's so true how important those conversations are. And I imagine a lot of parents and caregivers don't even know where to start to have those. And that could probably be a whole nother seminar. We are at 10 o'clock. So I want to ask you one more question, then we can wrap things up. And I understand if people have to go, no worries. How do you educate a client age 24 who keeps engaging in online relationships, since that's their only source of support?
Yeah, so I would start by finding out more. What are they getting out of those relationships? What are they missing from those relationships? What are their in-person interactions like? What would they like their in-person interactions like? And kind of starting from the positives, working to the risks or the downsides. What's the difference between where you are right now with your life and where you want to be? And what's the step that we can agree together that you're going to take next?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I know I've learned a lot from today's wonderful presentation. Thank you all for attending today's STAR seminar. For more resources around community trauma and resilience, please explore the Wellbeing for LA Learning Center. Thank you again for attending, and we hope to see you soon.